Hi everyone, my name is Emma. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm here with Catherine and Laura, and we're really excited to share some of our findings with you. We have a lot of interesting data to show you, and preparing this webinar was actually our first chance to dive into the data and really unpack some of these important themes. So why are we doing this study? Well, young adulthood, it's typically a time for career exploration and establishing oneself as a working adult. However, young adults with serious mental health conditions tend to struggle with school and work, which results in lower rates of high school graduation, employment, and enrollment in post-secondary education. Young adults with mental health conditions also tend to experience some additional challenges that impact school and work, such as involvement in the justice system, co-occurring substance use or learning disabilities, a traumatic upbringing, homelessness, or parenting at an earlier age. So why this research? Well, poor employment and education outcomes are known for this population, but we aren't entirely sure why. So we need to learn more about how young adults navigate school and work from their perspective. This way we can inform the development of interventions that best support them and their needs. So this research study is exploratory. Our aim is to look at these two factors, but since we have so much data to explore, for this presentation, we're mainly going to cover aim 1 and describe their education, training, and work experiences. So now I'm going to talk briefly about our methods and how we went about collecting the data for the study. To be eligible for the study, participants had to be between 25 to 30 years old or 22 to 30 if they were a young parent. They had to have been diagnosed with at least one of the mental health conditions listed. And they also had to report some experiences that they had related to their mental health, such as being hospitalized. And the reason for this is we're interested in recruiting young adults that had been most impacted by their diagnoses. And then we also like them to have some school and work history as well. So we conducted 90-minute qualitative interviews in which participants were asked to describe their school training and work experiences as a young adult and how decisions were made over time regarding these experiences. We also asked them how their mental health and other life circumstances impacted school and work as well. So we recruited young adults from a variety of sources in Central Mass, including clubhouses, referrals from mental health providers, and others. The interviews were conducted in the community, often at participants' home or another convenient location. And the majority of the interviews were done by Laura and me, and we are also young adults, and participants were compensated with a $30 gift card. So most of our interviews were recorded, all of them transcribed, and we used Deduce software for qualitative coding. And to date, we have collectively coded 50 transcripts thoroughly. And most of the qualitative findings that we'll present today are based on these 50. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our sample of participants and a little bit about who we interviewed. So we completed 61 interviews in total. The majority of participants are white, not Hispanic, and female, and 19 of them are parents. In terms of mental health diagnoses, most participants reported being formally diagnosed with multiple mental health conditions, and about 2/3 of the sample had been diagnosed before age 16 and have therefore been living with a mental health condition for quite some time. The most common diagnoses reported were major depression, anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder. And it's also important to note that almost 1/3 of the sample had co-occurring learning disabilities and/or autism spectrum disorder. The majority of participants reported at least one overnight hospitalization. And of those participants, most have had 3 or more hospitalizations. Not many, only about 21% of participants obtained a post-secondary degree, and an additional 44%, almost half of the sample, have attempted some type of college, and for multiple reasons have either dropped out or are still working towards their degree. And based on their educational levels in the previous slide, it's not surprising, but still very concerning that 62% of participants are making less than $10,000 a year, making the majority of our sample low income. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine Sabella, who will discuss our more qualitative results.
Thank you, Emma, for that great intro. So based on those 61 interviews, like we said, we've coded just about 50, slightly more now, and so we're going to focus on the qualitative themes that emerged from the coding process. Given our short time, we won't be showing you too many direct quotes, and as Emma mentioned, this was our first time to go through a lot of the data, so there's still a lot to kind of mine, if you will, and so hopefully this is only the first of several presentations we'll be doing with these data. Hopefully it doesn't feel like we're running through everything too quickly. So let's qualify those high school and college experiences a little more. So most in the sample have received a GED or received a high school degree. And while doing so, many had an IEP, an individualized education plan, were in separate classrooms or attended some kind of alternative or therapeutic school. Approximately 10 participants at the time of the interview were enrolled in a post-secondary education program. So of those 44% who had yet to finish college, 10 of those were still trying to get there. Community colleges were the most common environment to pursue post-secondary education in. Yet, unfortunately, we saw very high dropout rates, similar to the statistics that exist. About 25% of participants had tried college and had dropped out, were inactive at that point. And their education was really characterized by a lot of starts and stops in enrollment, interspersed with periods of work. Then they'd go back to school and they transfer school. So the path was very nonlinear. We saw quite a bit of job training experiences. So these are post-secondary training experiences that are somewhat more viewed as non-traditional, but very common and perhaps a good opportunity for some of these youth. So about 20 participants had completed at least one professional certification program. We're talking here about job trainings or certificates like cosmetology, hairdressing school, peer support specialists, certified nursing assistants, phlebotomy. And there were some participants who had attempted those professional certifications, but yet had not completed them. But overall, the success in the job training area was higher than in those who had attempted college. So more people are completing post-secondary training programs as opposed to the more traditional college. And we'll come back to that later. So at the time of the interview, just more than half of the sample were currently employed. When we look at the school and work experiences or the work experiences throughout young adulthood, retrospectively as they describe them, most of them were very part-time in nature. Most of them were in what we would call the secondary labor market, and those are usually fast food, service industry type jobs, usually with little or no benefits, like paid time off and things like that. And a lot of these jobs were very short-lived. There was a lot of what we would call job hopping. Some of these interviews became very long when we had to sit and really walk through a very long history. So many, many jobs worked in sometimes a very short period of time. And unfortunately, we did see evidence of stagnant career trajectories, so very limited growth over time. I can think of only a handful of participants, again, ages 25 to 30, where you would hope by then to start seeing some growth trajectories, and they exhibited that, but the majority of the sample were really kind of stagnant over time. And unfortunately, a few participants with very, very little work history for a 27 or 28-year-old. And again, it's important to note that we ended up, not purposefully, with about a sample of 1/5 of our sample were peer mentors or in the peer workforce, Massachusetts is somewhat the leader in young adult peer mentors. And so we had a lot of young people who were currently working as peer mentors, and we'll talk about that later or in a future seminar. And jobs were often found through supported employment, clubhouse programs, VR, but a lot of social capital was used to find jobs. Parents, families, and friends were really the #1 kind of referral source. I mean, and let's talk about, why are we talking about this again today? It's not just economic short and long-term benefits of working. Young people that we interviewed really told us the benefits and what they liked about working in school experiences, which included the social interaction it afforded them, overcoming isolation that is left when they kind of leave high school. They kind of lose that social interaction on a day-to-day basis. Many loved learning. We talked to really some smart people. They loved learning and being intellectually stimulated. It helped them with their overall wellness, to keep busy and occupied. And a theme that came out that we will be exploring more is this notion of helping other people. We found many people who had worked in or were pursuing jobs involved in caretaking or helping others. That included most of the peer mentors, people pursuing degrees in social work or psychology, or caring for the elderly and wanting to be a CNA or childcare jobs. And they were really driven by this desire to help others and spoke about it as a motivation. And often they are motivated to do that because they felt they didn't receive the help they needed when they were young, or just because it makes them feel good and meaningful. And all work activities, or most participants talked about just pride and self-worth, which I think all of us can relate to, and is a very normative reason that we get up and go to work every day. So of course, there are a lot of challenges, this bumpy ride. And here we're using this term intersectionality to describe how mental health and school and work kind of interact with each other. We've had already many discussions, and I think there'll be many more discussions about how these two layer and interact with each other. It's very hard to say mental health challenges cause problems at work, because sometimes it's the problems at work that cause the mental health challenges, and sometimes it's bidirectional. It's very complicated. But for sure, and somewhat not surprisingly, we did hear a lot of young people talk about social anxieties at work, stress and panic attacks at work, stress being on the front line, if you will, using the cash register or the front desk. The pace of jobs or required course load in college was also another one. Especially in work, we live every day. Our work, our digital world, gets faster and faster, and a lot of jobs required a certain pace that sometimes young people had trouble keeping up with, or it was just more that it stressed them out and was concerning. Sometimes medication side effects played a role in that, or some co-occurring physical or learning disability. And then there were many others that talked about just going through a difficult time and how that interfered with school or work, being, quote unquote, not in a good place. Many people who left school and work abruptly sometimes was due to having to be hospitalized. So when we asked them about times they weren't working or going to school, it was often because they were hospitalized or just were not in a good place. And sometimes it was directly related to either stressful or traumatic events, housing instability, substance use, all those other complications. But I think what's really important to note is that mental health and school and work interact, but it's very complicated and layered. We also heard a lot about unfair treatment. So a lot of youth and young adults that we talked to discussed feeling they had been fired or let go for an unjustified reason. Sometimes described as discrimination, but in most cases they hadn't disclosed. So it was just more feeling that they were just treated poorly by their supervisors or by the organizations that they worked for. Quite a few young adults who, quite frankly, are being overworked, taking on more shifts or hours than originally intended to, not getting equal pay, getting passed over for promotions or salary increases, and being asked to do things outside of the job responsibilities. And again, having trouble advocating when those challenges arose. And difficulty navigating new and complex relationship dynamics. While work or post-secondary school gives the opportunity to access a new social circle, often those relationships are more complex than those that they've encountered in high school. There are often authority figures involved or some kind of hierarchy. Again, social anxieties, meeting new people, or really encountering difficult supervisors or professors who were unwilling to listen, train, or provide time off. and quite a few challenges that were specific to school. So again, we're talking about post-secondary school, in this case, college, this mismatch of goals and courses. So we came across quite a few young adults who, quite frankly, went to college just because that's what society expects of them, that's what their parents expected of them, or that's what their guidance counselor told them to do. And unfortunately, I think what it seems to happen is that they enter college and they have to take prerequisites, they're at the community college level, and they're bored and or frustrated with the coursework, having to take math and in English 101 and kind of those requirements, and it makes them lose interest and then motivation, and then they just can't keep going. So that was really unfortunate to hear about, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then the attendance expectations, obviously for work and college, you need to show up and show up regularly, and that can be difficult, and we'll get back to that soon. And managing just the high demands of coursework, organizing work, and growing anxieties over assignments. And oftentimes, although not always, but there were some young people that talked about working and going to school and managing the multiple demands and the schedules, not being comfortable advocating for schedule changes, or, you know, courses are only available at a certain time and they're supposed to be at work. Those kinds of things came up. So there's kind of these additional challenges, or almost secondary challenges, again, specific, well, some of them are specific to school and work, but the major impact of most of those challenges I just described, both mental health, social interaction, or unfair treatment, is it leads to poor attendance at school and work, and therefore unsuccessful completion of school and work activities. So we had a lot of young adults talk about multiple times that they passively quit, i.e. just stop showing up at work. Others who kind of more actively quit by giving 2 weeks notice, or just kind of quitting on the spot and then walking out. Quite a few who got fired, unfortunately, for poor attendance, and several who failed courses or just did not complete courses, but also did not complete the formal drop process, if you will, and therefore did not obtain the credits that they set forth to do. And that leads us to another secondary challenge, is this financial aid piece. So again, as we've already seen, young adults are often going to college without clear goals. They are also going to college and struggling with attendance, and they are taking out loans to do so. And then when they either fail a class or try to take a reduced course load, it has financial aid implications that are complex and difficult to navigate. We heard from several young adults that they wish they could go back to school or training in some way, but accumulated student debt is keeping them from doing so because they have to work in order to pay off debt, oftentimes for classes and programs that they never finished. So they're paying for credits they never even received. So if you're like me, you're starting to think, okay, but there are things that should be or could be helping them, or what does help them? Well, we asked, of course, about disclosure. And again, disclosure is a very complex piece of this puzzle, because disclosure theoretically could lead to acquiring needed supports, but many chose not to disclose. Those who did disclose usually only did so after something happened, either to explain absences or an inpatient stay. And disclosure was most often informal because the decision to disclose is complicated. The supportive supervisor plays an important role, and that's often where we saw informal disclosure happening, when they perceived that their supervisor or professor would support them in that. But the fear of discrimination or judgment is very real, as we heard from these participants. Social challenges among peers, fear of being treated differently, some people saying it's none of their business, even though it's impacting my work, I don't want to go there. And a lot of people self-stigma, expressions of kind of internalized judgment. So again, pretty complicated, and I think disclosure itself will take us a while to peel away. And accommodations, again, for school accommodations. Let's talk about high school first. About a sixth reported having an IEP in high school or receiving some kind of special education services, and most of those did report it was helpful. However, very few of the sample who reported using accommodations in college. Helpful accommodations that were identified as either being helpful or could be helpful would be small group or one-on-one support, drop-in center or resource rooms, and the ability to take leaves or take breaks, leave class frequently and take breaks on the job, or extended due dates. And in college specifically, there was this lack of awareness or knowledge of accommodations or offices of disability services. And those that didn't know that they existed had trouble or encountered challenges approaching them. Either there was a lot of red tape, or a lot of requirements, or they didn't know where to go. So that's unfortunate, to say the least. And very few were advocating for their needs or disclosing at work. There seemed to be a perception that the job required certain things, and it is what it is. So the young people wouldn't even speak up. And there, again, was the close tie to disclosure or fear of stigma, especially in the workplace, I think. So what about taking a formal leave? Very few pursued a formal leave of absence from school or work, even when it was perhaps a good idea. More often they did so at school, and again, very few advocated for or asked for a leave from work. And again, those who pursued a formal leave of absence at school encountered a very complicated process that required documentation, talking to multiple people. And all those things are really difficult to navigate for any young adult, I would argue, but also when you're struggling with a mental health condition that is so bad that you literally can't function to get to school. Navigating that process is really difficult. Those who were successful in doing so had strong social or familial support that really they were able to take the driver's wheel, essentially, and get all those forms and paperwork required in order to get the leave of absence. And we also had people talk about how being on leave is very isolating, and of course, returning from leave is difficult too. So again, not to be all Debbie Downer, there were certain things we made sure to ask about what aspects of school and work were helpful. This big thing that emerged was flexibility. Flexibility of pace, being able to have some kind of flexibility in terms of scheduling or attendance. The ability to just take a frequent break, just the ability to, if your anxiety was rising or you felt a panic attack coming on, the ability to be able to just walk away and go to the bathroom and take a few deep breaths or go for a walk around the building or something. Those were all really, really helpful. And some young people who had tried in college and really experienced severe social anxiety about just being in a classroom environment found online classes very helpful. Sometimes formal school and work supports, clubhouses or VR were helpful. Sometimes they were perceived as unhelpful. And supportive supervisors and professors who encourage flexibility and a positive working environment seem to make all the difference. Those who had experienced it talked pretty much at great length about how important that was. And other strong social supports, family, friends, significant others, and also formal wraparound type supports. So we had quite a few clients of the Department of Mental Health here in Massachusetts that found a caseworker very helpful to help them with everything from financing and working on a budget to housing and those kinds of things, which in turn will help somebody at work or school. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to kind of try to pull it all together, and then we should have ample time for some questions and discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. So we just wanted to take the last few minutes of this presentation to summarize some of the key takeaways we're hoping you'll take with you today. Firstly, we want to acknowledge that young adulthood is not supposed to be easy. It's definitely a phase of one's life that's associated with a lot of trial and error and a lot of identity development, really answering that question, who am I? So things like trying out different jobs and different fields of study is very age typical. We also want to acknowledge that this is a naturally challenging part of life. Gaining independence, moving away from the support system of one's family, and entering the quote-unquote real world is naturally anxiety-provoking, and it's difficult. So we want to acknowledge whether or not you have a mental health condition, this is a tricky phase of life. And having a mental health condition, in addition to all these moving parts of young adulthood, just adds another layer to the equation. One of the key things we're walking away from this research study with is that college is not the only option for young people. A lot of our participants had success with vocational trainings and certifications, as Catherine mentioned. And again, a lot of our participants expressed that they felt like they had to go to college following high school, that that was the thing to do, and that was the way to success. But that's not necessarily true. And it can actually have people who are not necessarily college ready or college motivated at the age of 18. And that can ultimately lead young people to drop out of college and also accrue loans while not earning a degree, which can be a really tricky thing to get yourself out of. And for those who are enrolled in college and are on campuses, it would be greatly beneficial if on-campus supports were more effective and accessible. Ways in which we could envision that happening is an increased awareness in general that these services exist. It would be great if students with lived experience were made aware and reached out to and strongly encouraged to utilize support services and accommodations that are available to them on campus. It would also be great if there could be some sort of attendance support system put into place, following up with chronically absent students saying, hey, we haven't seen you in a while. Is there anything we can do to keep you enrolled in this class? Any supports we can link you up with to keep you enrolled, to help you pass this class, to keep you engaged on campus? And lastly, efforts to reduce stigma on campus would be very beneficial. Just raising awareness about mental health issues and also trying to decrease discrimination on campus would likely make students feel more comfortable and confident on campus, and as a result, more likely to seek help. And across the board, positive social supports we found can make a big difference. A lot of our participants had challenging upbringings, haven't necessarily always had the most solid support systems in their life. But if they are able to find dependable and supportive people in their young adulthood, that can really put them on a pathway to success. And these can be people in one's personal life, having a really supportive parent, a great significant other, a strong friendship, or it could be more in a professional sense, having a great boss who's invested in one's career development, or a professor who serves as a mentor. Things of that nature can all make a huge difference and really promote a young person's success. And we also wanted to note that individualized approaches are key. Jobs that have flexibility to match the needs, strengths, and interests of young people are preferred. And this flexibility can come in terms of things like the pace of work, scheduling and attendance policies, and the level of independence a worker is given. And there is no roadmap to what works best for young people. So it's good to expect a period of trial and error as you try to find the right fit for a young person in your organization and find what meets their needs. And lastly, we put this in big letters because this is a huge theme coming out of our interviews, is just how incredibly resilient young people can be. And we saw that time and again with our participants. Again, a lot of our participants noted coming from difficult backgrounds and challenging family dynamics, and they have faced significant obstacles in reaching their school and work goals. But despite these challenges, they are still very much committed and intend to reach their goals and are highly motivated to positively contribute to their communities. So through this research endeavor, we've definitely, our belief that young adults are resilient, strong, motivated, and capable was very much validated through talking with these young people. And that concludes the content, kind of our summary of what we found through all our interviews. We wanted to leave you with some resources that we have available through the Transitions Research and Training Center. We have several tip sheets that are relevant to the themes covered today and some products. And so we provide, and these, our slides with these links included will be posted on the Transitions RTC website if you want to access these links at a later date as well. And we also wanted to recommend some other resources from outside our center that can be really helpful in supporting young people with mental health conditions succeed in school and work. And these include the Job Accommodation Network, which you can visit at askjan.org, Lifeline, an online college resource, and also a link to the JED Foundation, which does a lot of great work promoting emotional health and suicide prevention among young people. And with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Dee, and we're going to see if folks have any questions for us.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you, all three of you, for that great presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in. The first one, did you analyze the relationship between looking for employment and receiving SSI or SSDI benefits? I wonder if their understanding of employment income affecting SS benefits.
Great question. This is Catherine. We were just looking at each other here, realizing how quickly we got through those slides, because a few minutes earlier today, we thought we were going to go over time. So we had not included any data on SSI or SSDI. Anecdotally, I think we all definitely talked to quite a few young adults who had either were currently receiving SSI, SSDI, or had in the past. Some of them talked about how they had used it as a crutch, but didn't want to use it at least one or maybe a few times. It did come up, the whole concept of going back to work while on disabilities and needing to find somebody who was very knowledgeable about that. So again, somewhat speaking off the cuff, I think it did come up, and we'll be looking at it in more detail at a later date. I think a theme off the top of my head was that they often needed to seek out assistance to understand. I think they knew they could go back to work while on it, but they needed assistance understanding how and when and what the requirements were. Laura, Emma, do you have anything to add to that?
I think a subsample of our population were very mindful of their benefits and the amount of hours they could work and the amount that they could earn while maintaining their benefits. Okay. That's something young people, some in our sample were pretty cognizant of, but it wasn't an overwhelming theme. Yeah. Or I think that they were aware now, but they had needed help to get there is kind of what I remember. Oh, I'm sure, yes. 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 I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We have another question. It starts with, you mentioned something about VR services being helpful, but in some instances they were not helpful. Do you have any data on how many participants were working with VR or vocational rehab?
Hold on 1 minute. I thought I had my, I'm sorry, this is Catherine. I thought I had my notebook because I just looked at the data the other day. I would say, so to be clear, we didn't ask specifically, have you ever worked with VR? It was more broadly than that. Did you ever receive any employment and education support? I would say maybe 10 to 15 had interacted with VR in a few different ways. There was a handful of people who had received financial assistance from VR to go to college or to pay for college. And then the majority of them talked about having a job coach. And I think the majority of people who had job coaches thought it was helpful. We also asked young adults what they didn't have that they thought would be helpful, and the idea of a job coach came up a couple times there, unprompted. I think the case of a job coach who was not helpful had to do with this other kind of sub-theme about, help seeking and seeking out professionals that could help across the board, whether it was a psychiatrist or a therapist or a job coach, was all about a personality match and or personality characteristics that were or were not helpful. So that's what I have off the top of my head. Same thing with clubhouses. A lot of the positive feedback on clubhouses was in regards to the social support provided by being at a clubhouse. And the housing support, applying to schools and applying to jobs. Some of the young adults had experienced what clubhouses call TE, or transitional employment. Some of them really liked that. Some of them felt that the TE options available to them were below their capabilities. And as I think people who might know who are involved in clubhouses, there were quite a few young adults who perceived clubhouses as not being youth-friendly and then eventually overcame those, or who perceived them as not being youth-friendly went and felt justified in the fact that it was mostly older people and that's not where I want to be. So again, this plays into that individualized approach. I think there are a lot of factors. Since it's not a quantitative study, we can't really analyze it too much in terms of cause and effect, but just, again, explore some of those themes and what might be going on.
I think that covers it. That's a good summary.
Thanks, Catherine. One person is just asking if you could put back the slides, the first resources slide back on the screen. I think she missed them and would like to see them again. And one person was wondering if you're familiar with the BEAR Reintegration Scholarship. And she submitted some information about that, which we can share with other folks if they're interested. Let's see. Another question is, did students who did utilize the college disability services find that there were enough support to help them succeed?
I think I can recall a couple students who said that if it wasn't for disability services, they never would have graduated, which to me stood out because it shows that there is some merit to needing to make these things more accessible. I don't want to mix my sources because in the past I've done research that shows that it's not helpful. What I thought was helpful and I put up on that just on the accommodation slide was some of the more creative accommodations I heard. So, okay, let's go off. Beyond this project, we have heard in other research studies from young adults that they go to disability services and disability says, okay, do you need more time on tests and or do you need to take your tests in a quiet room? And it's like, that's like the #1 kind of offered accommodation. And I think we heard a few other creative strategies, again, just like a drop-in center or a resource room or tutors that, you know, could access tutors through seemed to be really helpful. Again, the ability to kind of take extra breaks, sit in the back of the room and just get up and walk out and come back in, you know, without the teacher kind of giving you the side eye, things like that. Again, so I think across the board, there weren't too many who had used disability services because accessing them was so hard, but those who did, I think, was mostly positive. But I also know that, again, there's a lot of variety here and diversity. So again, that individualized approach, I would love to see just a little more work done on what disability services are offering students with mental health conditions. And we've done some of that in some other work, but really knowing how to handle what a person with mental illness needs as opposed to what a person who's visually impaired or hard of hearing needs. I think it's a very individualized approach that's needed. And so a blanket kind of list of accommodations doesn't always work. That was a very long answer, but while I have the screen up, the Transitions RTC Resources, halfway down is the manual, the Survey of Innovative Practices for Young Adults. That's a new product from another grant that we did, but it was a survey of exactly that, innovative practices around the country who are succeeding in engaging and retaining young adults in employment, education, and other services. And so again, it's a nice list of things and or practices or principles that seem to be really effective in engaging this population. So I would suggest that as well. Any other questions?
Yes, we have a bunch, so hopefully we'll be able to get through them all. The next one is, what were the key components that led to success for young adults who manage school and work and mental health at the same time?
Well, I can't just kind of call those up and query them right now, but I think we hit on some of them. What do you guys think? I think some of Laura's takeaways really hit on that.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind straight away is their social support system. If they had really supportive individuals in their life who could kind of motivate them and support them as they work through all the trickiness of young adulthood, that really seemed to give young people a leg up and help them be successful.
Yeah, that's where I was going to.
I agree.
Yeah. Coping skills is another area. So we touched on, or Emma touched on the fact that most of these young adults had been diagnosed prior to the age of 16. But as anybody knows who's been a young adult or has worked with young adults, it takes quite a while to understand who you are as a young adult, who you are as a young adult with a mental health condition, and who you are as a student or worker with a mental health condition. So even back to the last question about disclosure and accommodations, often young adults are still figuring out how their mental health impacts them and what they need to therefore help them. So I think those who had a better sense of what coping skills were good for them and or who felt that they were on the appropriate medication, I mean, it varied in terms of what worked for them in terms of managing their mental health condition. I think the social support comes in there, but again, continuous quality care from a therapist or provider also helped as well.
Yeah,
Emma, did you have something?
Yeah, I think you're right, Catherine, and the support systems, but also just knowing your diagnoses and knowing your triggers and trying to figure out coping skills and whatnot. There was one participant who really advocated for accommodations, like kind of out of the box accommodations, and she was like, I have insomnia and I know that I can't do a morning class, and was like, can you work with me so I can get into afternoon classes? And they were like, yes, we'll work with you. So that's like an example of like a successful accommodation happening.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. So another question is, do you have any recommendations on how to work with a school when a student needs education assistance but doesn't want the school to know? I find it hard to work with the school without being able to tell them who I am and why I'm there. I'm not sure if this is someone who works with young adults and is trying to help them, or if this is personal experience as a young adult.
Well, in order to...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Dee.
Oh, no, just go ahead.
Well, in order to get accommodations at work or school, but specifically college, you need to disclose to disability services. However, disability services, that information is kept private, and they aren't allowed to share your diagnoses or anything with professors. And then you have the choice of which professors you want to disclose to and what level you want to tell them. So you can say, I have a disability. You don't have to go into detail that it's a mental health condition. So there is some choice in who to disclose to, but in order to get these formal supports, you need to disclose to disability services. Did you have any?
No, I think that's accurate. Again, informal disclosure would be done at your own discretion, but I think in my experience, even as a professor and as a student, when a student comes and is asking for help, it's often best to understand where they're coming from and to ground that kind of help or that ask in what's going on. And again, you know, with disability services, the benefit of disclosing, I mean, it's a requirement, but it's also so they can work with you in the most effective way and make sure that they are helping you in the most effective way. So I think it is required there, but it is important, as Emma noted, that although then you are noted as having a disability of some kind, the nature of that is not disclosed. And that goes for the same thing if you said you had epilepsy or if you had some other physical but unseen kind of condition. You don't have to tell your professors what it is.
Right. Yeah, and I would recommend disclosing, or at least making an appointment with disability services right off the bat, just to see what types of supports you can put into place, so that if it got to the point where you needed to take a leave of absence, you have those supports in place. You'll be able to, you know, withdraw from classes and do all the necessary things so that you're not set up like at a loss, and then like fail classes or whatnot. So I think it is really important to get those supports in place, right? Just kind of being proactive about it.
That's a great point, Laura, and I think some young adults might be, and so again, if you're a parent and you have a young person going to school, just kind of encouraging them to look at it as a safety net. But agree, if you set that relationship up in the beginning of the semester, it doesn't mean you have to use it. Yet they already know who you are and have some information on file. When things get critical, you don't have to go through as much red tape. They kind of have, you've gotten that out of the way, and then you can just say to them, I'm struggling, and they can triage that rather than having to deal with all the paperwork. That's a really good point.
Right, right.
So one of our viewers had a question or a couple of questions. Did any of the young adults you worked with report any other systemic barriers to work, such as having a criminal record? Did any of them have 504 plans versus an IEP? And did any of them report bullying in the workplace if they did disclose, or if they didn't disclose but it was noted that they were out or something like that?
Can I take it? This is Catherine, I'll start it and then they'll join in as they have been doing. Criminal records, yes, came up at least a couple of times. I think more so a barrier was those people that had very minimal work experience. So those people who literally didn't have a resume or who had only worked under the table, or just had nothing to show. Talked about, you know, who's going to hire me? I'm 27 and I have no post-secondary degree and, you know, 2 minimal jobs. And so they kind of perceived that as a barrier to being sought after. Bullying, I think, definitely came up in the workplace, but I think it was more around people who were LGBTQ and or had co-occurring learning disabilities or autism spectrum, and so therefore suffered from more kind of outward social anxieties. But I think it was the perception of being, again, that comes back to that navigating those complex relationships. So there was definitely some fights at work with coworkers or even arguments with customers or bosses, so kind of controlling that. But the bullying, I didn't see too much of it. Definitely talked about at an earlier age. A lot of young people talked about being bullied as kids in middle school or high school or even earlier than that.
Yeah, I think what came up more often than, you know, coworkers bullying is what Catherine touched on earlier, is like unfair treatment by bosses towards these young adults.
Yeah.
As their supervisors and employers. A surprisingly high number of participants reported being fired from positions for reasons they viewed as being unfair and unethical. So I think kind of that relationship and perceived mistreatment by bosses.
Or my boss was just a jerk, you know, he was just kind of a jerk or a sleazeball or things like that. Finally, the 504 plan, there were quite a few that discussed their 504 plan, but not in a very descriptive way in terms of how helpful or not helpful it was. It was more like, yeah, I had one. We talked about what we were going to do. I really wanted to go to college, and they told me I shouldn't, you know, things like that, unfortunately. So I think they use them, but I don't think we have data to describe it very much.
Yeah, and I do think having an IEP was much, much more common than having a 504 plan. So we got a lot of more feedback on the IEP experience than the experience of having a 504 plan.
I think we appreciate all these questions, though, because as we said, we're just now getting into the data, and so to be honest, we didn't really unpack a lot of the IEP 504 stuff, and maybe when we go back, we'll uncover more. So thanks for letting us know what you guys are interested in, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have time for probably one or two more questions. This one is more about the participants in your study. Did you guys keep track of the types of colleges the participants attended? Were they larger universities, smaller private colleges? And did the students see any benefits or disadvantages from one or the other, if that's anything you collected?
Go ahead. Community colleges, as we said, were most often used. Again, that might be, well, so for folks who don't know Worcester, Massachusetts, there are, I think, upwards of 10 colleges or universities right even in Worcester. But that includes one major community college, and Massachusetts has a strong community college network. So most young adults had either started or only stayed at community colleges, two-year colleges. We did have a handful who did the more traditional four-year private or big university. But so we have those data to answer your question. We don't have it in front of us. And again, we definitely have not started to see if there was any differences or pros and cons by college. Again, this is where what kind of riles me up is just the variability among universities and what their policies are, how you access services and what services they have available to you. So again, that's also where we saw this diversity in experiences. It had, you know, in practice, what this means is if you're working with a young adult or the parent of a young adult, you know, really in looking at colleges, really understanding what resources they have on campus across the board, especially for mental health conditions. Even, you know, what's the campus climate in terms of mental health conditions, active minds chapters or NAMI on campus chapters, how many students with mental health conditions are seen by the disability services offices, what kinds of resources do they have, is really important. So I don't think we can answer your question, but those are just some thoughts around it, I think.
Okay, I'm going to try to combine two questions, and then that will probably be it. So one person asked, why were the disability services so difficult to access? And then, did you find out if many of the participants entered college with a mental health condition, or was the condition, did it come out when they were in school?
What's the diagnoses again, the age of diagnoses? I think the majority had been diagnosed, or a third of them had been diagnosed under the age of 16. And then I think another 20 to 30%, well, I can go back to people, were diagnosed kind of during the high school or college experience. Oh yeah, so two-thirds were diagnosed at under age 16. So the majority are entering college with it, or we had definitely quite a few people who were diagnosed their junior, senior year of high school or that first year of college. Again, those really critical transitional times where there's just normatively a lot going on. What made disability services inaccessible? Was that the question?
Yeah, I can give that a stab.
Go ahead, Laura, and then I'll ask.
Okay. My reaction to that, why was disability services so difficult to kind of engage with? I think there's two sides to it. If you're struggling mentally, if you're not feeling so great, you're living with a mental health condition and balancing the symptoms it presents with daily life. You know, university departments such as disability services, there can be a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of necessary paperwork, and if you're not feeling super great, it can very easily get overwhelming, and if you're not up to take care of a lot, you know, that would probably be one of the first things to go, to be like, this is too much for me right now. I can't put in the work required of me to access the services that this office provides. I think that's a part of it, just being kind of overwhelming. And I think another side of it is that it's kind of an identity issue. I think a lot of young people want to be like anyone else on campus, and I think a lot of this is internal in young people's minds. They just want to be a normal college. Sometimes to enroll with disability services, and disclose in that way. It makes them feel not normal in a way, and stigma is still a thing that exists on campus, so navigating that and your identity with your mental health condition, I think at times can make people hesitant.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.